Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in. This is Adesoji Speaks Knowledge, a show for seekers of authentic information on Africa past and present. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla, an African history scholar with years of study in the bag. For more information on Africa's history and geopolitics, subscribe to Adesoji Speaks Knowledge on YouTube. Without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. Greetings. Welcome again to Adesoji Speaks and the African News Review. And as a regular guest, he's a household name. We have Comrade in Arms, Revolution, African Explorer, you name it, journalist, Milton Alimadi. He teaches African history at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He holds degrees in journalism from Columbia University, economics from Syracuse University, is the author of the well-publicized Manufacturing Hate, How Europe Was Demonized in Western Media. So he knows a thing or two about how the media works. So we're here to pick his brains, as it were. So, Brother Milton.
I can do. As always, we're happy to be with you.
Yes, my pleasure as well. My pleasure. My pleasure. And yes, we're talking about the media, and where best to start with great African writer Ngugi Thiong'o, who has taken it upon himself, based on one of his books, Writers in Politics, to write to a politician. And here we go. Open letter to his president, William Ruto. Okay, so this letter stems from him writing, William Ruto, on behalf of concerned Kenyans and also Africans alike. And, the writing clause. So he says, we begin. Dear William Ruto, the images of your recent visit to the U.S. was very disturbing to me and to every patriotic Kenyan. I saw you seated on a chair grinning while Biden stood behind you, his face beaming with satisfaction. Why not? He had just announced that he has signed off our beloved Kenya to make it a non-member ally of NATO. In other words, you have agreed to become NATO's errand boy in America's struggle with Russia and China for access to resources of the continent. This part stood out to me. He then admonishes him, Ruto, do you know that NATO murdered Muammar Gaddafi so that Libyan oil fields, which Gaddafi had nationalized, would revert to the West? Gaddafi was once the chairman of the African Union, of which Kenya was a founding member. But this other picture was no less disturbing. While you were inside the White House, Haitians were in the street demonstrating, calling you a slave. Do you know the history of Haiti? Please read Black Jacobins, the book written by a once Jomo Kenyatta Pan-African ally, C.L.R. James. So, brother.
Yes.
What's your take?
Of course, this stems from the recent visit of President William Ruto of Kenya to the White House. And of course, when an African leader is invited to the White House and is hosted with state dinner, and only perhaps a handful of African presidents have been so fitted in Washington by the President of the United States. It comes at one could say a price or a cost. There's a famous saying in the United States, there's no free lunch, correct? So, the great author, Ngugi Thiong'o, is basically castigating, he's of course Kenyan, so I guess he would feel strongly about it, even if he was not Kenyan, because Ngugi is an international citizen of the world. Pan-African, a supporter of workers all over the world. So he's for the working people. So you talk about that image, of course, and I'm sure many listeners saw that photo
The picture.
of Ngugi,
Of William Ruto.
sitting behind Biden's desk, where the United States president normally sits, with Biden standing behind him, while Ruto is seated.
As if
It's almost like a father image.
he came to bring your son to work there.
Exactly. Here you go, son. And
Sit and pretend.
you cannot help but see the imagery that it could be seen as, here you go, boy. And that's what Google, of course, is also referring to. It says you're the Iran boy.
One boy. Yeah.
Of imperialism. Now, the question is this. Is it Ruto who asked to sit behind the desk? Or was it Biden that offered? Think about it. I find it highly unlikely that the President of the United States would say, Mr. President, would you like to
sit on my
sit for a second?
Oh, my God.
But it's not unlikely that a Ruto, who of course wants to maximize the propaganda value around the world and in Africa and in Kenya in particular, that I have arrived. That said, Mr. President, could I sit behind there for a second? Because he knows the value of that full opportunity. So that's something that I haven't read anywhere. I don't know who asked who, but nevertheless, the point that Ngugi is making is very strong. And then it goes, of course, to the history. Why are you being co-opted in such a manner as a non-NATO member ally of the United States? Do you not know what NATO did? Do you know the murder of Gaddafi that we all watched, in real time? We actually watched live. The video was being streamed. It was being dragged. And, pretty much murdered before our eyes, right?
Yep, very much so.
And all because of the resources, which, by the way, they never got, because Libya is now a no-go zone. Nobody's benefiting from the oil that the West wanted. And then, of course, he's saying, don't you know that Haiti holds a special place in the history of all Africans? The first country in history where the enslaved African masses rose up and defeated their masters and declared an independent republic.
The Western Hemisphere.
You see? An achievement whose reverberation, of course, was heard in the United States, where millions of Africans were still enslaved. And of course, that lesson of Haiti, the enslavers, the slave masters in the United States did not want that example to spread. So even though Haiti right now has been reduced almost to its knees, it's not always been on its knees. So we must not just see our sister brothers in Haiti and dismiss them as a so-called failed state. It is a so-called failed state by design. It proved that it could be master of its destiny.
True.
When they declared independence after defeating the French. So to see another Africa now being used, yes, of course, Haiti is chaotic. It's very unstable right now. But in Ngugi, like many of us suspect, that this is not about introducing stability in Haiti. Otherwise, why would not this be an African Union project where you have multiple countries contributing forces, right? Now you have one designated country, one designated leader, meaning it's easier to manipulate this intervention and to give instructions to one leader. So essentially it's saying you are acting as a proxy of the United States, because obviously with the past disastrous interventions, beginning of course in the early part of the 20th century, with the U.S. occupied Haiti and destroyed its economy, literally hijacked its national bank and constitution, So given that, the U.S. is very cautious about the optics, how it would look for another United States intervention. So many people suspect that this role has now been outsourced to William Ruto and Kenya, and that is what Brother Ngugi is lamenting.
So essentially, we now have a black face of imperialism in Africa, which gives us a very disturbing prospect. Not least
and that's what he's lamenting.
Yes.
Correct.
I mean, not least because the history of Kenya itself is laden with resistance.
Absolutely. And of course, and I'm glad you brought that point, The revolutionary history of Kenya is not as widely taught and not as widely familiar as the revolutionary history of the FNLA, for example, in Algeria. When in fact, one could say that the Algerians and other Africans that later fought national wars of liberation, like the PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau, like the MPLA in Angola, Frelimo in Mozambique, the Patriotic Front,
even the ANC
of Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe, and the ANC as well, all took lessons from Kenya, the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, which was, of course, denigrated as the so-called Mau Mau by the British. That was a really revolutionary act, where the Kenyans fought to recover the land that had been stolen by the British colonialists. So he's reminding, in that letter, he's reminding also William Ruto that even though you want us to forget that history, we can't forget that history. So in fact, Kenya has much in common with people that have fought wars of national liberation, and of course, Haiti being one of the example much earlier.
I mean, there's a book I'd like to read from, Not Yet Uhuru by Oginga Odinga, who was one of the foremost liberation leaders in Kenya.
A socialist leader.
Yes.
And I think it was Kenya's first vice president.
Before he jumped ship, for obviously frustrated with the path that was followed by Jomo Kenyatta.
Correct.
And it's the foreword to his book, Not Yet Uhuru. Not Yet Uhuru. The foreword is actually written by none other than Kwame Nkrumah, who himself was the first head of state of Ghana. And I'll quickly read just a very short paragraph. It was in order to eradicate completely foreign rule and domination from Africa, to fortify the continent against the turbulent world of power politics, that we bent our concerted effort towards unity. It is in this sense that I consider the establishment of the OAU as an important step forward, which is what Ngugi is alluding to there. And I will end with this part. He said, although political independence is a noble achievement in the struggle against colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism, its effectiveness is superficial unless economic and cultural independence is also achieved. The road to the attainment of economic, cultural independence is beset with neocolonialism, which is becoming even more menacing to its newly independent states than orthodox colonialism. So essentially, Ngugi, with this letter, is warning us that the problem is still very much real. And we're talking about 60 or plus years. And we're still having to contend with the issue that the problem now is, as my people would say in Yoruba, which is the germ that besets the greens actually lives on the green itself. So the problem is hosting. No, the country itself is hosting its own problem. You've got a leader here who doesn't quite understand his position in the world, and instead he's hawking himself around for validation. The validation you've already have with your people. So any last words on that?
Well, I mean, a number of points. I think, sadly, we as African people, or any other formerly colonized people all over the world, we were miseducated. Independence, or uhuru, was an end in of itself, which of course is incorrect. Decolonization is a process, and political independence is just one aspect of decolonization. So we have to remind our sisters and brothers in Africa or formerly colonized parts of the world that we are still trying to decolonize. We're living in a process of decolonization, right? We still don't control our sovereignty.
Yeah.
We don't control our resources. And even our minds, as you saw, as you can say, Ruto is a brilliant example of a mind that has not yet been sufficiently decolonized. Could you imagine Mwalimu Julius Nyerere sitting behind Biden's desk with Biden standing behind him? Or any American president desk with the American president standing behind him? Just try to picture that image.
I can't.
Could you imagine Kwame Nkrumah agreeing to do something like that? Even Jomo Kenyatta, who, of course, you could say had nationalist credentials and then turned into the epitome of the bourgeois state and bourgeois leader. I can't even imagine Jomo Kenyatta doing that. And let's even select the most reactionary of African presidents from the 1960s and 70s, Mobutu. I can't imagine even Mobutu doing that. I think Mobutu would be cautious enough to see how this would play out, the optics, right?
Of course,
and
of
say,
course,
no.
of course,
of course. Mobutu, this reactionary thief, the assassin of Patrice Lumumba. I don't think so. And that's why the more I'm talking about it, the more I think that the idea did not come from Biden. I think the
idea was his.
Probably came from President Ruto himself.
Okay. So speaking of access to resources, the one that was alluded in the article we just went through, he take us back to this week, June the 5th to the 11th, 2000, marked, in 2024, marked 24 years since the 6-Day War in Congo. And the 6-Day War in Congo was actually a war that, which is quite funny, a war that was fought by Rwanda and Uganda in Congo for control of Congo's resources. You can't make that stuff up. So I've gone into The Economist, and our friend The Economist would always give us a very nice. He said, Uganda, Congo's hidden war. This was how it was reported in year 2000. Uganda and Rwanda used to be friends for nearly 2 years now. They've been fighting each other in Congo with devastating consequences. They could not agree who had started the war in Kisangani. Kisangani is in the eastern side of Congo, and it's near the rich resource area of Congo. Right. Nor who ended it. For 6 days last week, Rwandans and Ugandan soldiers on foreign soil and more than 500 kilometers from home rained shell and mortar fire on each other, killing up to 250 civilians in this sprawling riverside town in central Congo, wounding over 1,000. Much of central Kisangani, including the imposing cathedral at the river edge, was destroyed. It was the third and by far the most brutal times these two armies have battled for control of the town since they began fighting each other. And this is one very critical part. It is dispiriting enough that Rwanda's president, Paul Kagame, and Uganda's president, Yoweri Museveni, old friends, once described part of a new generation of African leaders, should be at war. It is doubly so that the wider consequences should be so grave. The struggle waged deep inside Congo is a serious setback for efforts by the United Nations and others to help Africa solve its wars. That last part is key. To help Africa solve its wars.
Right.
Your take.
It's propaganda, of course. It's not Africa's wars. It's
a war of resources.
Corporate war resources. It's imperialism. It's much more a modern itineration. It's a bit much more clever than the brute colonialism of the 19th century and the parts of the 20th century, of course, where now you outsource the brute face that was manifest by European soldiers committing massacres against Africans. Now, when you have Africans doing it, African armed forces, specifically Ugandans and Rwandas, on behalf of imperialism, you can't say this is colonialism anymore. So it allows these corporations to whitewash their crimes and say, see, if the economist says, solving Africa's wars, why would they want to solve Africa's wars? Think about it. Logically, it does not make sense. And I keep reminding sisters and brothers, you have to know history. And then it makes you, it allows you to understand what we see in our contemporary era. At one point, as Walter Rodney kept reminding us, we, as African people, were seen as merchandise, commodities, correct? And shipped all over the world to provide our labor for free to develop these places. So it's a process. The countries that are now industrialized, the wealthier countries, have always benefited by exploiting us as human beings, as human resources, and later on, our mineral resources. It started before the technology developed with rubber, it was ivory, it was food stock, and then later on, of course, mineral resources, petroleum, gold, copper, diamond, uranium, cobalt, coltan, you name it, always benefiting people outside Africa. So, as old school root colonialism ended, it was essential to find new ways. And you read briefly what Nkrumah was talking about, neocolonialism. So neocolonialism, now you outsource some of the work that used to be performed by Europeans to Africans, because then the optics are much more sanitized, right? In terms of protecting the European image, And then you build up the propaganda of Africans always being at war, right?
Yes.
They just wake up and they say, I'm feeling African today. Let me go and kill another African. That's how it's projected, you see? So now, the economist is talking about Rwanda and Uganda fighting, look at these Africans once again, when in fact, they were fighting to see who would be the number one, how can you say, the field, the house Negro, right? The house Negro on behalf of Western corporate imperialism.
Mm.
So they thought, no, it can't be two of us. I want to be the chief, Negro in charge, Kagame. No, Museveni wants to be the chief Negro in charge. So you come through me if you want to steal Congo's resources, right? So now Kagame has his army in Congo, Museveni has his army in Congo, and both of them want to be the errand boy, the role
West.
that has now been designated to Ruto.
Now.
At that time, Museveni and Kagame were contesting, it's me. And that is why they fought in a neighboring country over resources that don't belong to them, over resources that they can't even use because their economies are primarily agricultural, not industrial. The resources they steal from the Congo are then shipped from Uganda to Europe and North America and to Asia, to the factories there. Same thing, the resources that are shipped to Rwanda. So they're killing fellow Africans on behalf of corporate industrial imperialism. And that, what year was that? That
was 2000.
That's 2000, and today, in 2024, that same war is still continuing in Eastern Congo. And both Museveni and Kagame are still involved, still contesting to see who will be the chief Negro in charge.
That's the beauty of history. The mere fact that 24 years ago, you're still having those echoes today. And
Absolutely.
the same framework, the same players, the same actors are in play over the same night. So that's little side note there to help Africa solve its wars. These are not wars, like you said. These are not wars fought for the benefit of Africans. These are wars fought in order to be the go-to errand boy for
these are highly
access to
profitable wars.
Yes,
as most wars are, by the way.
Well, war is business, isn't it?
Except for the victims, of course. There's 7 or so million Congolese that have perished in these wars since 1997.
I mean, this is just systematic of the kind of problems that Africa on a larger scale faced. Most of the wars you have on the continent are not instigated by Africans.
Correct. And they will never be, quote unquote, solved because here's the problem. If Africa has peace and stability uninterrupted, 10, 15 years, who is going to be able to exploit Africa? Think about that.
That's a good question. That's a good question.
And once we're in control of our resources and we're getting the fair value and we are manufacturing as well, it means Europeans' lifestyle is going to have to diminish a little bit. But that's, at the end of the day, that's what they don't want to do. At the end of the day, it boils down to simple greed. Europeans have become accustomed to Sonata. Look at France, for example. France gets its energy to power the country, to power the economy. About 75% is nuclear energy, right? And the uranium comes from Niger, right? And it gets it at pays peanuts, as Americans say. Right?
Yeah.
So do you think France, this is just one micro example, would want to see a stable, strong government
in Niger
that controls its destiny in Niger, that demands to get the fair price for its resources? No. So this is just one example. So now you multiply this by all those 54 African countries. And now you have a better understanding of why chaos, instability, conflict is part of the necessary condition for Western and increasingly now Asian interest in imperialism to project itself on Africa. It's not by
Yeah,
accident. You think that with all the resources available in the world, if stopping conflict in Africa was an avant priority, you think it would not be accomplished?
It will be. It will be. It will be.
Look at the brutality of World War II in Europe, when an estimated 60 to 80 million people perished as a result of that war. Did that not stop at some point?
They did, and came up with rules of engagement.
The economies completely of Europe. Where are those buildings now destroyed with the bombings and the shellings? Does Europe even manifest that it has lost that little war? So why is it only that in Africa we can't resolve these issues? Think about that. It is essential for Africa to remain weak, divided, in conflict. Not totally at war in every location, because then it becomes difficult to extract resources too, you see? So it's managed. It's
organized chaos.
Organized chaos. If every part of the African continent was like Eastern Congo, then it would become a problem. You see?
Well, as long as we can tiptoe around the problem spots.
Exactly. No, think about it. You know?
Yes.
So for anybody who's deluded and think there's some mystery, I read all these academic papers, crises in Africa, the challenges of, as if there's a mystery. They have these high-level academic conferences. Yeah, they call it what? White paper, blue paper.
Yeah. Think tanks. Think tank has just released a report.
Think about it. There are no need for those papers unless the paper is saying these conflicts are by design and they will always manifest so long as the industrialized countries profit from Africa's conflicts and Africa's resources. Africa is the way where China was before the Chinese Revolution, you see? Where as late as in the era of World War I, even the earlier stages of World War II, where you had European, American, Western soldiers could still be deployed on Chinese soil. Can you imagine? Can you imagine that happening today in 2024? Of course not. But at that time, China was chaotic. Of course, it has a great history of civilization, just like Africa does. Right?
Yes.
Great empires, in China. But China was very divided, right? But then, after the Chinese Revolution, and one can condemn the excesses of whatever happened during the revolution, but nobody can challenge the fact that today China is a global power. You see? Because China is now united. The 1.4 or 1.5 billion people are the citizens of a united Chinese nation. You see, the People's Republic of China. Okay? The same thing with India. That is why you are seeing more and more about India now, more coverage of its economy, right? Economy is now larger than the economy of Britain.
Recently.
Right? Of course, it's still a long way because Britain only has a fraction of India's population, which is also about 1.5 billion. But both India and China are at a different location compared to Africa, where you also have 1.5 billion people, but they're the citizens of 54 different countries. And that makes a difference. It means the governments in each of those 54 countries have different priorities, right?
Yeah.
They cannot accomplish what Nkrumah wrote about in Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, where he's talking about the collective planning of their politics, of their military, of their economy. You can't do that. Even check Anta Diop wrote about that too, right?
Yeah, Black Africa, the economic basis for a federated state.
Absolutely, right? He wrote about that. He says, we have the cart before the horse. He says, so long as we have all these governments, we cannot make a collective executive decision We can talk about industrialization until kingdom come. Nothing will change. The politics is very important.
Speaking of politics,
because after China changes politics, that's it. Then its economy started changing to where it is today. And that happened after the Chinese Revolution.
So speaking of politics, we are in the year of elections. We've just had South Africa's elections, the fallouts we still have. Government of national unity is yet to be formed, but they're in the throes of that. Rwanda, too, would be going to the polls. I'm sure you would like to know that. Rwanda will be going to its polls.
Well, I can tell you who's going to win. Yeah, if they're willing,
let's find out. Let's find out
together. $1 on the table. I will give you a prediction right now.
Let's find out together. Okay, so the understanding, according to the New York Times, Rwanda's 2024 elections, what to know? A report filed by Abdi Latif Dahor from Nairobi, Kenya. Why does this election matter? Rwanda's presidential and parliamentary election this year are taking place 3 decades after genocide in which some 800,000 people were killed. Paul Kagame, who helped end the bloodshed, had been in power ever since and is expected to win again in this election, which takes place on July 15. Under his rule, the Central African nation of Rwanda has achieved significant economic strides and has become a leading contributor of troops to the United Nations peacekeeping forces. But critics say Mr. Kagame has overseen a repressive state accused of widespread human rights violations and where power and wealth are reserved for his ethnic Tutsi elites. There is another part. The election is taking place against the backdrop of rising tensions within neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo. Mr. Kagame has accused the Congolese officials of backing Hutu rebels who fled after committing genocide in 1994 and who he says plan on returning to finish what they started. Mr. Kagame has in turn been accused of sowing chaos in eastern Congo by backing rebel forces who have carried out massacres and displaced tens of thousands of people in the country. Now, who is running? You did say you know who is likely to win, so you might get an inkling from here. Who is running and who is likely to win? Mr. Kagame, 66, is expected to win a 4th term, according to observers. There are no independent polls in Rwanda. I wonder why. In 2015, he oversaw a referendum that changed term limits, ensuring he can extend his tenure until 2034. In 2017, he won with almost 99% of the vote. Wow, that's very unanimous. In an election that observers said was rigged. Oh, okay, those are Western interests again. The arrest and prosecution of opposition members, the intimidation of activists, and accusations that many voters were forced to choose Mr. Kagame all pointed to voting that was not free or fair, independent observers and human rights group said. So here is Mr. Frank Habineza. He's the chairman of the opposition Democratic Green Party, and he has submitted his papers to run for president. And he seemed very motivated.
Poor guy. But he's courageous. I have to give him that.
Okay, yeah. I mean,
he's courageous. But the article itself has so many fallacies.
Okay.
I believe that the correspondent of the New York Times, whom I think I met, he may have actually. I spoke in to a class at Columbia. I think he was still a student at that time. I don't know if he's the one who had invited me to come to speak at the Columbia Journalism School, which of course is my alma mater as well. Yeah, I mean, I like a lot of his writing, his coverage, except of course he's also subjected to the editing process and the propaganda that they have to plug in the story, right?
Mm-hmm.
So early on, at some point in the article, they're saying Kagame is credited with stopping the genocide in 1994, without saying that, since he likes referring to critics and observers, without saying that he himself actually has been accused of instigating the genocide.
Genocide itself.
And for people that are not familiar, they should watch Rwanda's Untold Story, which is a BBC documentary. And I think you can see it via Venmo. Documentary which was never shown in the United States, by the way. Because
I wonder why.
The BBC produced it, there was an aggressive propaganda and attack. BBC was banned from reporting from Rwanda for a couple of years as a result of that, and accused of genocide denial ideology, just like many of the critics of Kagame have been accused. In fact, I remember a few years ago, for one of my editorials on Black Star News, I was also referred to as the genocide denier on one of the websites in Rwanda. So I may not be eligible to visit that country for a while, for my own protection, of course. And then there's another reference there, the very preposterous reference by saying, the election is believed to have been rigged, and that he won by 99%. How do you win something that has been rigged and by 99%? So the use of the term won is also very preposterous. I mean, you could say he awarded himself victory. That would be much more accurate. So, there's an abuse of words. It's mind-boggling. It diminishes the meaning of winning, right, and victory in elections. And then the other point that I noticed, based on what you just read, is also very problematic, and only people who pay very close attention would see what is being done, the spin, right? So he starts off by saying, Kagame, about conflict between Rwanda and DRC.
DRC, yep.
Of course, anybody who is an alert human being would know that the root of that conflict is the fact that Rwanda has invaded the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Correct.
Under the guise of M23, a supposed Congolese rebel army, which in fact is essentially Rwanda's official armed forces under a different name. And they have experience in doing this since 1990, when Rwanda was initially invaded from Uganda by Paul Kagame and his compatriots. At that time, he was an official member of the Ugandan armed forces. He was chief of military intelligence. He was one of the many ethnic Tutsi that grew up in Uganda because their parents had fled massacres and genocide after the revolution in 1959, 1960, when the ethnic Tutsi monarchy was overthrown in Rwanda. And then they morphed from the Ugandan official military, they became the Rwanda Patriotic Front. So they're using that same template again, M23, when in fact it's part of Rwanda's regular military. It has artillery, it's throwing lobbing shells to Congo, it has drones, it has its own air force, essentially, right? So rather than beginning with that as the root of the conflict, if you notice, the article says it first mentioned Kagame's beef with Congo. It says Rwanda accuses Congo of supporting Hutu rebels who fled after committing genocide in 1994, right?
Yep, correct.
30 years later, the same people who fled are still fighting, right? People who would have been in their 20s and now would be in their 50s and 60s
are still fighting. And we are supposed to. See, so if you don't pay careful attention, that will just go by you.
Because that's from a template So you just Google when you're writing an article, and you just copy that and put it in your article. And if you've been doing that for 30 years, you don't realize that somebody who pays attention might be saying, wait a minute,
this doesn't make sense.
60 years old right now?
Exactly.
Yeah, you see? So that's why it's good to have people that on top of, Western media manipulation to deconstruct, the text. Okay.
And also to add to what you just said now, it's also the notion that you're writing, okay, this is the New York Times. Your book, Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in the Western Media,
right,
takes them to task on their various reporting,
right,
ethos. And to think, despite books like that being out there, there's another one on the Palestinian question. The name escapes me now. The same line, the same way of operating, and they're still doing it in 2024.
Right. It's a problem. I mean, I said this 30 years ago, right, when I first did my research, more than 30 years ago, at Columbia University, the graduate school. So this started as my master's paper, right?
Yeah.
Before it developed over the years into a book. And I've never really spoken, publicly about this aspect. Of course, the New York Times are very concerned by this history that I developed of their racism toward Africa, historical racism in African coverage. I went back to an editorial, I think it was sometime in the 19th century, right before the Berlin Conference, right? So it was maybe early 1880, 1776, I think, right? 1876, before the conference in 1884. And they were, the racist projection of Africa and saying, England should go and colonize and civilize, the natives. And I brought it all the way to the era of the 1960s, when they actually started sending correspondence to Africa, right?
Yep.
And what was even worse was that I discovered what today in the 21st century would be called fake news, right? When they concocted things that never happened in Africa and wrote about it. I gave you in the past example of people in Nigeria dressing grassroots skirts, which even the writer of the article, Lloyd Garrison, complained to his editors in New York. Said, "Who inserted that in my story?" He read it when he's somewhere in Nigeria. He's like, "What are you?" Right? So they're very concerned with that history. I know it. And in fact, what I did was I offered to be an ally with them in getting them beyond this history. Before I even graduated from Columbia, I said, let me write an op-ed saying these are the things I discovered. This is where the Times is today. This is where you need to go. Right? So that offer, of course, was declined. But even then, I was willing to be a part of the Africa coverage, right? Okay. Because after all, I actually met with Joseph Leopold, who was one of the reporters and then later editor of the Times, whom I admired, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when I wrote to him, I complained about, because what happened was my article was supposed to be published in a magazine, Columbia Journalism Review, and then they backed out, so I realized they were afraid of the Times. So I wrote to the publisher of the Times, Salzburger, and he wrote, and Leopold wrote to me. He was the managing editor. So we developed a rapport, and I was supposed to go to be their correspondent, not their correspondent, but their stringer, working with the correspondent in East Africa, and the correspondent was based in Nairobi. But, and then this is things that I started thinking about later on, about the level of their concern. I'll give you a few incidents. So when I first went to meet Leopold in his office in the New York Times building, the deputy a foreign news editor, came to meet me. And he was holding a copy of the letter that I had sent to the publisher that had excerpts from my thesis also.
Okay.
And one of the most notorious of the Times writers, his name was Homer Bigart, Bigart. And he wrote a letter when he was first sent to Accra to cover, tell us how the natives are doing now. After Ghana had been independent for a while, so it was sent in 1959. And he wrote something, and I'm paraphrasing. And he said, he compared Nkrumah to a Henry Wallace, who had been an American politician from the 60s, the 50s rather, to a Henry Wallace in Burnt Cork. That's what he's saying about Nkrumah, right? And he says, yes. And then he's saying, I prefer the primitive bush people because, after all, cannibalism is the best antidote to this population explosion that everybody is complaining about. So that's in his letter to his managing editor, to his foreign news editor, Emmanuel Friedman.
And he was not taking to time.
I went and I said, let me see the articles published around that same time. And it had a perfect correlation between the views he expressed in his personal letter and what was published in the New York Times purporting to be article. So these are the kind of examples that terrified of. So the deputy foreign news editor, I forget his first name, his last name was Weissman. So he comes and he greets me before I go to Leopold's office. And he said, I never liked Homer Bigard. I'm like, what's the point? I'm not saying you're personally,
you're personally tied to him.
Why are you feeling that level of defensiveness? So that's one example. Let me give you a second example. So the correspondent of the New York Times at that time, her name was Donatella Lodge. And, she had established a reputation as being this fearless, woman reporter who had reported even from Afghanistan, during the era of the Taliban, where they were fighting against the
Russians.
No, not the Taliban, the Mujahideen.
Fighting against the Russians.
The Russians. Yeah, the Soviet Union at that time. So she was supposed to work with her as her stringer in East Africa. So then I meet her for dinner, right?
Mm-hmm.
Around Colombia. This after I'd met with Leopold in his office. We discussed, going to work with her, blah, blah, blah. So I meet her, we have dinner, and then she's walking me toward the train. We're still chatting. And then she said something like, oh, by the way, Joe, Joe Leopold, I don't remember if you referred to him as Joe or by his last name, Leopold. Anyway, she said, he liked my paper, my master's paper.
Mm-hmm.
You see? And obviously, she's telling me that Leopold is actually agreeing with the
content of your,
yeah. So he's an ally, you see? So I took that, okay, good. But then she asked a very strange question, which I only deconstructed much later. She said, what do you want? Suddenly, journalists sometimes they think, they get kind of ambushed.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you want? I said, oh, what do you mean? I said, what do you want?
What do you want?
What do you really want?
Just want you to be forthright.
It was later on that I realized, you know what?
You have been made an offer.
They think, I think their number one concern was that this work never come out, in a wide, broad, disseminated widely.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that, of course, now I look back, my Columbia Journal Review could not publish it. I think they thought I wanted something, like a quid pro quo. It could not be that this guy
was just
wants to be
my
stringer and then eventually maybe come back and be on staff at the New York Times. No, I think, and then I look at it, I think it's a kind of a very American mindset, that I got you to give you something in return.
Pay me and...
Exactly, you see? And they couldn't believe that I actually wanted to help them improve their journalism. And that has been very similar. Since then, the book is now out, but the book, my own publisher, is no longer promoting my own book. You see?
Let that
anybody can speculate as to, what happened. The book was doing very well when it came out. I know because I was getting very decent royalty checks, right? And if I'm getting a decent amount, it means the publisher is getting
they're selling the book.
You see?
Yeah.
And now, as you yourself know, many people, including yourself, you order the book and you wait for months.
Before you get it.
You don't get a copy of the book, right? Some people get it months later. Some people never get their copy of the book.
And some people get they get the electronic copies with pages missing.
Think about that. Obviously, they never reviewed it, even though somebody told me, I write for the review section, send it to so-and-so. I sent it, never heard. But it's fine. So this is the challenge of us
doing this work,
countering this propaganda. And you can't hide knowledge from people, you see? So as you know, I'm in the process of trying to get back my copyright. They want me to buy it. So, I'll buy it back from them. And I'll make sure that this work is widely disseminated, no matter how long it takes,
I mean, I'm looking at my copy here, well beaten up. Still, it's a lesson in reading. It's how manufacturing hate, how Africa was demonized in Western media.
Correct.
You could get a copy on Amazon if you're lucky, but please try.
You'll wait for a long time.
It's well worth the wait because it's a brilliant book to have. And if you see my copies, it's all written in, so probably put that away.
In fact, I want to get an Africa edition as well. You see, I want an African published as well.
Okay.
I mean, it's very funny. Many years ago, I sent the manuscript, I forget his name, Thabo Mbeki's brother. I believe it's his younger brother. And he was involved in publishing. I don't know if he's still a publisher. People can look up his name. Mbeki's brother is with the publisher in South Africa. So I sent him the manuscript. And I got I believe it was an email, response. And he said something like, South Africa is sort of, moving in a different direction.
No.
Oh, yes.
What sort of direction? You're not focusing on factual news. You're moving in a different direction to where?
No, I guess my book would just,
stay the honest man.
Actually, there's a long section on South Africa as well.
Yeah.
The New York Times was like, very accommodating to
the apartheid region.
Officials during the apartheid era who are giving their racist spin on the need to maintain apartheid because the Africans were not used to that level of civilization and all that kind of nonsense. So I guess he thought that rehashing that history was not what South Africa needed at that point in its history.
It's chapter 9, the New York Times as an early apologist for apartheid.
Right.
Yeah,
so we are still looking for the publisher for the African edition and the African market.
Yes. So what is your take on who will eventually win the election?
Well, there are no elections really in Rwanda, but this is what I fear. I fear because, obviously the constitution was amended. I'm not sure whether it has time limit. I think it does, but I think it did not apply to him.
Yeah. So
he was allowed to run for another. So it was amended, but then it became fresh. I think you have 2 7-year terms, right?
Yeah, correct.
So 7 years ago, as the constitution was amended, or the new constitution, he became president for the first of the 7-year
7 years.
terms.
Yeah.
Meaning, after this, he would be eligible.
For another.
I think he is eligible to be president until 2034. Okay, so this is my concern. How are you going to transition away from this one person? Because as the article said,
He's 66.
the article said in the Times, the most troubling part is that the economic and political power is reserved.
Yeah.
Excuse me, for the ethnic
Tutsis.
Tutsi elite. That model is not sustainable, when you comprise about 15% of the population. It's not a sustainable model.
It's a recipe for disaster.
What will happen in the long run? You see, you can't just legislate and say we're not going to discuss issues of Hutu, Tutsi. We are all one people. Okay, well and good that you're saying that and writing about that.
But in practice,
if you're not, putting that to practice, it means a potentially explosive situation is going to be bottled up for a long time, and you cannot keep it corked perpetually. So that's my number one concern. How are you going to deal with these issues in the long run? You see?
And so you think he will be defeated in this oncoming election?
Oh, no, of course not. It's an election that he is managed. And then that's part of the problem. That's the fear, though, that once the country is down the line, it's not in a position where you are able to manage these elections. We cannot manage it perpetually, because the fact of the matter is that none of us, live forever. And by virtue of being around at a particular historical moment in Rwanda's history, 1994, you were able to elevate yourself in a commanding position to use the argument, whether it's not 100% accurate, but it's still a strong argument that it is I who stopped this genocide.
Which is
so
factually incorrect.
I should be entitled to rule this country, and if I tend to have a heavy hand and authoritarianism, it is far much better than what was before me, which was the genocide, right? So you can make that argument. So are you going to instigate another genocide so that somebody can make the same argument down the line? True. Of course not. Or should I not rule that out? You see? So how are you going to sustain it going forward? That's my number one worry. These superficial elections,
and the area where
they're only important in the sense that it prolongs something that needs to be.
And the area where his country sits is also deeply problematic. You've got that corridor of constant flow of people, and with real or imagined enemies.
Correct. Actually, there is one solution, of course, which in fact, even I think it was Nyerere who may have suggested it a long time ago, and that would be an East African Federation. Because when you have an East African Federation, they're not going to be pitting Hutu and Tutsi. Now they're part of a broader federated East African region. And because one of the issues they have also is, of course, the issue, it is one of the most densely populated countries in the whole world. So they have the issue of the land strife and resources. But now they're part of a larger Pan-African United Federated, nation. Now you have freedom of movement, relocate to other parts of the Federation, which is not as densely populated as Rwanda or Burundi. So ultimately, if it evolves that way, then of course, the concern that I'm expressing today, that's how it will be resolved down the line.
So speaking of larger countries, we've got another neighbor of theirs to the north, who's been in turmoil for a while. and by that I mean the Sudanese. Apparently, a Sudanese gathering outside the country proposes a third way. And for those who are not aware, Sudan has been going through turmoil. So a Sudanese gathering outside the country proposes a third way, but the main forces may still end up in charge. Now, apparently, according to The Economist, a paper of money, a glimmer of hope was provided this week by ordinary Sudanese civilians rather than two armed forces battling for supremacy on the ground. On May 27, to the sound of joyous ululations, the coordinated bodies of the Democratic Civil Forces of Sudan, more snappily known as Tagadom, began a 4-day convention in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, chaired by Abdallah Hamdok, Sudan's last civilian prime minister. Tagadam seeks to rally a wide coalition of Sudanese as possible to stop the civil war and return the country to civil rule. People from all 18 Sudan states were represented among the 25 delegations from Sudan's worldwide diaspora. Was a sprinkling of Stetsons. Another 30 delegates were from displaced people's camps. A full 40% of delegates were women. A similar proportion were counted as young, meaning under 45. The Tagadom had drawn support from some of Sudan's main political parties, such as the Umma, as well as a handful of armed groups that has so far been neutral in the war. The result was a heady miss, which Meredith Preston McKee, a Canadian veteran of many peace negotiations in East Africa, called this conference the most inclusive process he has ever witnessed. I will just end with this one. Mr. Hamdok, a former Sudanese, a former economist and the Tagadom leader, said they want Sudan to be a secular democracy led by civilians. It can be looked as if they favor any group opposed to the SAF, which is the South African Armed Forces, which has its roots in the oppressive Islamist regimes led by Omar.
Sudanese Armed Forces.
Sudanese Armed Forces, yeah. Which has its roots in the oppressive Islamist regimes led by Omar el-Bashir from 1989 to 2019. So, the reason I picked this story was I was fascinated by the agency being exercised by the Sudanese.
Right.
And it's not often that you get the Western media, showing this aspect. Yeah. So, what's your take?
Well, I like it that they're doing that because for people that are not that familiar, when it comes to political organization, Sudanese civilians have always been way, way ahead of the game, right? Activist politics, organized unions,
yep.
Politics. They're as advanced as one could say South Africa was, during the struggle against apartheid. You could say that civil society is very organized as Senegal has always been, right? And the Sudanese have been like that. The Sudanese are one of the few places where civilians have organized and come on the streets and deposed military regimes, including Omar Hassan Bashir's own military regime in 2018, of course. So the fact that they're able to organize a gathering like that, and I think the article mentioned 600 delegates.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of people that
with women as well. With women as well.
Right. I think it's at 40% of attendees would want to play a role in salvaging their war-torn country.
Yeah.
And of course, the problem is, there are a number of possibilities, right? The main obstacle are the leaders of the armed people engaged in the conflict right now, right? And the leader of the Rapid Response Force?
Rapid Response Force, Hemedi.
Right, General Hemedi, and General Burhan, who is the commander of the official national army, right? So long as they're in command of their armed forces, the people gathering and meeting now in Ethiopia, it's very ironic. Ethiopia itself just It's still, at the tail end of its own civil war.
Yeah.
Just officially concluded. So they can come up with all the agreements, the communiques, and plans for the future. But so long as they cannot implement it on the ground, because these two military commanders decimating the country, particularly the Rapid Response Force, accused of, genocidal massacres in parts of the areas that is fighting to try to control or to take away from the national armed forces. Some of the killings based targeting on religion, on ethnicity, on skin color, it's just so horrific. So how are you going to neutralize these two elements? There's only one possible, path, which would be for the junior command, to get rid of, the top commanders, to get rid of General Burhan and Hemeti, correct? And say that we are pledging our support to the civilian process that is ongoing in Addis Ababa. That is a preferable outcome if that can happen.
Yeah.
Right? Because even if you say, we need outside forces to come and help us neutralize these commanders, how is that even going to happen in practice? Nobody wants to get involved in a bloody conflict like that if the armed parties are not willing
for,
unless somehow a solution can be worked out where they would actually agree to cease fire and to eventually demobilize and allow peacekeepers to be involved. The selling point being is that Burhan would not have the capacity to try to eliminate Hemeti and vice versa. So none of them
would
have an advantage.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it's highly unlikely that they could remain in the country. So each of them would have to accept exile and to leave the country and to designate new commanders of their factions, and then, of course, to integrate them into one national army under the civilian command. That's another outcome. Otherwise, they're going to have this third force, agreements that look very good on paper, and then not being able to implement it on the ground. But they're doing the right thing. They're putting pressure on these two military generals. They're saying the option is not just Hemeti or Burhan. The option
is the people.
Are people that don't have blood on their hands.
Fact.
So I think that should be their demand. Ceasefire, agree to go into exile so that we can come and take administration on the ground. That's, the question is, are they going to accept ceasefire? I guess maybe if they build enough momentum so that the countries that are now funding, and I think the article also implies that, are funding Burhan and funding Hemeti, now the cost of funding them becomes exorbitant. They can't do it anymore because of diplomatic and even effective sanctions. Against them. The threat of sanctions against them if they continue to fuel and finance and arm this war. The more I think about what they're doing, I commend them, and I think it has the possibility of succeeding, depending on the momentum it generates and the global support that it picks up. It's good to see that the corporate outlet, such as The Guardian, The Economist, is actually giving it some good play. With the proper tone as well.
Exactly. That's the key. And for me, it's also, hopefully it works, because if it does, it becomes a template for any other.
I'm glad you said that. It becomes a template for Cameroon. It becomes a template for many.
For even Congo.
Of the world. Well, Congo is a bit different because I think Kagame actually needs a conflict in Eastern Congo. So long as he's president of Rwanda, he needs Congo's resources because, as I think we discussed an article from the Financial Times, where Congolese officials are saying Rwanda's economy benefits to the tune of $1 billion in Congo's resources. That's a very significant chunk of the budget to just lose, you see?
Of course.
So, you know,
the whole has to be constantly plugged. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. We started with a writer, and I think it's important that we close. I think we should close with another one. And the story goes that Senegal is buying back the library of one Leopold Senghor. So the article, it can be found in Radio France International, on the Radio France International website. And it's titled, Senegal buys back library of poet president Leopold Senghor from France. There's a whole raft of history in this headline alone. More than 300 books collected by first president of independent Senegal, Leopold Sédar Senghor, will be transferred to Dakar after the Senegalese government stepped in to stop them being auctioned off in France. You can see an array of them. And in total, 344 volumes would leave the house in Normandy, where Senghor spent the final 20 years of his life, several of them personally inscribed by authors including Martinican poet Aimé Césaire. Along with Césaire and other African and Caribbean intellectuals, Senghor was one of the founders of the Negritude Black Consciousness movement, deeply problematic, in 1930 Paris. We didn't want to see the collection split up, given it includes works that document the emergence of the Negritude movement, said Céline Labrune-Bardien, a historian who helped coordinate an international project to inventory Senghor's archives. On the instructions of Senghor's heirs, his library was to go under the hammer at an auction house at the city of Caen in mid-April, divided into nearly 200 separate lots. But the newly elected president of Senegal, Bassirou Diomaye Faye, asked for the sale to be suspended while his government negotiated to buy the complete collection. What's your take?
Well, it's very ironic, but of course I support it and endorse it 100%.
The buyback?
The buyback. I'm happy to see that is being done.
Okay.
Of course, the irony is that this is a former president who sort of had the reputation of not only aligning himself politically very closely to the former colonial power of France, but also alleging cultural affinity between the two nations, almost to the detriment of celebrating African history and culture. So, of course, as you know, he later on became one of the most quote-unquote conservative of the post-independence African presidents on the continent. You could say that he was seen as the antithesis of Kwame Nkrumah, right? Where you have Nkrumah being the African nationalist, Pan-African, talking about African unity, taking control of our economy, our resources, which of course implies challenging Western dominance of Africa's destiny. But then on the other hand, you have on the opposing pole a person like Senghor, celebrating European culture, which of course implies acceptance of imperialism, and saying that we can actually develop and benefit from this mutual relationship between Africa or between Senegal and France. And of course, it's really highly impossible to have mutual benefit when the economic relationship is one of exploitator, you see? So, and it's ironic that, as the article says, the last 20 years of his life after he stepped down
From
as
office.
president. I believe it was in 1980 when he stepped down.
Correct.
About 20 years of his life spent in France, not in his native
Senegal.
country of Senegal. But so at this point, I do not take a harsh view of him.
Mhm.
I think his works are worth purchasing by the Senegalese state. Obviously, we have new leadership in Senegal, young leadership,
Mhm.
including the new president, Faye, who is more oriented to the Kwame Nkrumah school of African
Young
politics,
leaders. Yep.
Pan-African unity, taking control of our resources, taking control of our sovereignty, and so forth. But he is looking at Senegal. He's looking at Africa. This is a true Pan-African. He's not playing petty politics and saying, oh, you know, there are people who think Senghor was a reactionary, was a foundation for neocolonialism in Africa. No, he's looking beyond that. He's saying this was the first president of post-colonial Senegal. He was an intellectual. You cannot deny that. He was a poet, was considered to be high-caliber writer. So whether you agreed with him ideologically or not,
Yeah.
it is worth purchasing his archives because, and this to me is the most important part of it all, his archives and his notes and his correspondences will actually explain to us
His mindset.
what type of pressure he might have endured in order to make some of the decisions that he ended up making. So I see very informative books and writings coming out of owning this archives. And of course, this is very important not only to Senegal itself, but to other African countries where academics, intellectuals, and ordinary students want to learn the type of pressures that our post-colonial leaders endured, and how is it that we ended up with the current type of African states that we have.
And also, I would, to buttress, to add to what you said there, it's also not only just the motivation in the political side, but also on the intellectual side, why he chose to concoct something that doesn't exist on the continent that most of the intellectual class, the likes of Wole Soyinka, the likes of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Chinua Achebe, push back upon. By that, I mean the negritude movement. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he was the motivation behind Frantz Fanon writing Black Skin, White Mask. Because the finger was pointed, and every time I read it, especially the introduction, you begin to understand, these are the kind of people he was talking about.
Well, so the negative movement, I think it came under more disrepute much later. I think initially it was seen as something that was very welcome because they were promoting African writers, African poets, African arts. And then, of course, the criticism that came later was that they were trying to validate
the French.
Africa. They're trying to say, okay, Europe, you've shown us all these works of art and literature, and we can do it as well. And here's the proof. Here are the examples. But then, of course, the critique came from people that said, we don't need to validate. We had empires before some European nations, including England, existed. We built the civilization of Kemet, right?
Exactly.
Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Aksum, Nubia, right? Meroe, right? Congo Empire, right? So we had it all. There's no need for us to validate ourselves with a movement, right? So you can see how when it first started, to many people, it had its appeal. And you can also see how the criticism that came later was also justified.
Funny enough, you should mention Kemet. The foremost authority on the African continent is also Senegalese.
Of course.
Diop.
And the Diop.
Who he undermined.
Anta Diop was treated very shabbily.
By him.
Absolutely. He was harassed, you know. He was politically persecuted, right?
Yeah.
Rather than celebrating and saying, you know what, we have an African genius. Can you imagine if he had the support of the state, what he would have been able to accomplish, you know? Instead, they're saying, why is this African wanting to introduce a Pan-African language? Why is he making our European friends uncomfortable by telling them that ancient Kemet was actually Black African? Why is he reminding them that Africans existed and then about 100,000 years ago, they migrated to other parts of the world, and over a period of 30,000 years, through climatic and environmental adaptation, they became people that eventually were known as Europeans, Asians, and so on and so forth. Senghor didn't like that. He was teaching people this because it made his European friends uncomfortable.
And also the fact
but
that...
at the end of the day, I support what the current government is doing in Senegal. I think that is as Pan-African as it gets. So saying we're looking beyond our ideological differences with Senghor. His materials are going to enrich our
African conversation,
collective knowledge, not only for Senegal but for Africa. So I support that 100%.
Yeah, I mean, when I saw the article, not just as a lover of books, it's also the fact that you read both the people you agree with and those you disagree with.
I agree.
So,
and comment. Might I add one more thing?
Go on.
Before we conclude. I've always been an advocate, and I hope I can get more support, of having a Pan-African archive or museum. You see? And since we have the headquarters of the African Union, and by the way, earlier in the discussion, we mentioned the Organization of African Unity, OAU. For people that may not be familiar and that are just coming into knowledge of African history, the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, was, of course, the first Pan-African organization created in 1963 by the leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah and so on. And that was replaced by the African Union in the year 2002. So I just wanted to mention that. But the fact that the AU headquarters is in Addis Ababa, to me, Addis Ababa would also be a good location for the Pan-African Museum and Archives, where each African country can donate some of their rich archival or artistic material, the best of the best. You know, some of the Benin art, right? The spectacular art. Why not donate a few of that to that museum? You know, some of the Congo, the art from the Congo, spectacular. Donate some of that.
And the books.
So you have an African section, you know, each. And so when I walk into this magnificent museum in Addis, I can, you know, whether it's done by region, West Africa section, and then I find, you know, Ghana, Nigeria, you know, Gabon, you know, you name it. I think this is something that we as Pan-Africans need to support, and let's start working on it, you know?
Yeah. I mean, that also the notion that you now have a receptacle where you have all the works, not just cultural. I mean, if you just look, I was looking at African Writers Series, and the kind of authors that are on there, you're wondering, where are all these books? You know, some of them now you struggle.
Can you imagine an original of the original print of Things Fall Apart? Just have one encased in that museum, right?
Yeah.
Original print of the palm wine drinker.
by
have that.
Amos
You know.
Tutuola. Yeah, my God. Yeah,
You know?
that is.
No, we as intellectuals have to start advocating and campaigning
Mm.
for this Pan-African Museum. And then some of the work that is now being freed up and returned to the continent, some you keep in your national museum, some,
True.
loan it out to the Pan-African Museum in Addis Ababa,
Yeah, and and then that would also then probably generate curiosity on the part of whoever comes in contact with it there to actually visit the home place or wherever they are.
Absolutely, and it would be a revenue generator. MoMA, the Met, the London Museum, the Louvre in France, in Paris, they generate tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars. And then many of the people that go there go to see African artifacts. So now we have one of the best collections on the African continent. It's a source of revenue, and that revenue, since it's a Pan-African museum, with each and African country being a shareholder, some of that money could go to paying the dues of African nations to the African Union. People that don't pay their dues. In fact, they might have a surplus. You pay your dues, and you actually get some money returned to you on an annual basis. Really, let's work for this idea. Sometimes we have to be creative. We can't just sit back and have others, come and suggest these ideas for us.
I mean, we still have some of our elders around, and with them being the leading voices, and we doing the groundwork. It's achievable. It's achievable. It's achievable. Again, I will thank you for coming through. For those of you who watch this, please like, share, subscribe, and bring others to the fold. We hope to continue to do this. It's the African News Review. Again, I have my eminent guest here, Comrade Milton Alimadi, and thank you for coming through. And any last words?
A luta continua, as someone on Marshall used to like to say. But let me tell you a very funny story.
Go.
And you've heard this story. A luta continua means the struggle continues.
Yeah.
I forget the author of this book about Fela. So Fela was taking a flight. I think it was coming from a European country, coming back to the continent.
Okay.
And on the plane, there were many liberation fighters. I think it's either from Angola or Mozambique. I think it was in Mozambique. And then they were saying, a luta continua, getting with Fela. And Fela said, what does that mean? And they said, the struggle continues. And then Fela said, oh, no, we can't be saying that. We should be saying the struggle must end. Because that, to me, represents victory and liberation. So don't go around saying the struggle must continue. From now on, start saying the struggle must end.
Okay, so...
I love Fela.
So yes, we will leave on that very happy note and say over to you.
Okay,
the struggle.
See you next week.
The struggle must end. And yes, thank you very much for coming through. And good night, everyone. And thank you. I hope you found this week's episode informative. Join us next week on Adesoji Speaks Knowledge as we continue to help you reframe the narrative about the African continent, past and present, by providing you with accurate information to give you a true and clearer picture of events as it pertains to Africa. Please remember to subscribe, like, and share. Thank you.